This is chapter 27, and because of the length and importance of these chapters, I didn't want to be rushed to cram in a 15-minute voiceover in one big long PowerPoint. I'm splitting chapter 27 into a part A and a part B, which I will voice over now and put on Blackboard for you. So chapter 27A deals with wartime growth and problems. Now, the U.S. was pretty much an isolationist country with respect to foreign policy. It didn't want to be in another war. World War I ended in 1918, and Americans wanted to come home and continue to grow the economy and prosper. Um, Even Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 was not entirely persuasive in changing that isolationist attitude. And, our immigration policy was so limited that we would not readily take in, uh, you know, uh, for instance, refugees who had managed to escape the Holocaust at this time. The attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on December 7th, 1941, on the island of Oahu, changed all of that. Changed all of that. We were no longer isolationists. We couldn't afford to be isolationists. Yeah, in 1940, we were starting to help out Winston Churchill and England in their fight against, the Nazis. But December 7th, 1941, changed our isolationist position with respect to both fronts of the war. Uh, of course, at this time, the U.S. had not recovered from the economic depression of the 1930s, but gearing up for war changed every bit of that really essentially overnight. From 1940 to 1946, the federal government spent $360 billion dollars in the United States on various aspects of the war effort. Nearly 10% of that money was spent in California alone, so it was a tremendous economic multiplier. By 1945, personal income in California was more than 3 times higher than the pre-war figure. It was an astounding amount of growth. Many existing military installations in California were expanded, and many new ones were built, including the Strategic Air Command Base, the SAC base, Castle Air Force Base in Merced, which came online at this time. This is a picture from strategicaircommand.com from 1986, the front entrance of Castle Air Force Base, which is now Castle Airport in Merced County. It is home to a rather interesting museum of aircraft. If you've ever gone on Amtrak and gone north of Merced, you can see that aircraft museum outdoors. In any case, there was a consolidation and closing of Air Force bases and military installations in 1995, in which Castle Air Force Base was involved. So it has been closed as an Air Force base since 1995. That is a civilian airport. The shipyards were big during World War II. Henry J. Kaiser of Oakland was the chief private entrepreneur of California's wartime shipbuilding industry. Kaiser opened a steel mill in Fontana, I believe, and they even had at one time the biggest cement making plant in the world. And so Kaiser was responsible for building a lot of shipyards. Um, in full operation, California's shipyards were building one so-called Liberty ship every 25 days. And get this, launching a new freighter every 10 hours. Peak employment reached 300,000. These jobs in the Kaiser shipyards had great benefits. Job training, group medical benefits especially, and of course the Kaiser Permanente medical system today is a remnant of this wartime medical benefit scenario for Kaiser employees. So it was really a template for that kind of health care. And this is an aerial view of the Hunters Point Naval Shipyard in its heyday on the San Francisco Peninsula back in 1948. These new wartime jobs offered a new lucrative employment opportunity to minorities and women. This is under the theme of Americans All, as it was said at the time, especially by Hispanics. Now, in spite of that, unions continued to discriminate against workers of color. African Americans, of course, hoped for double V, victory against the overseas enemy and victory at home against discrimination. But even in wartime, African Americans and other racial minorities incurred a great deal of racial discrimination and vitriol. Just really, really quite awful. Um, African-American woman, a worker by the name of Frances Albreyer, successfully campaigned to change Kaiser Industries' hiring practices. That was a big, big deal. And Taria Hall Pittman helped newly arrived Southern blacks to fight discrimination in California. And the kind of discrimination they experienced when they first arrived in California from the South to take these incredibly lucrative industrial jobs. It was the same kind of Jim Crow discrimination that existed in the very states they left, which was quite a disappointment. So these two women, Albreyer and Pittman, were quite instrumental in making things better for African Americans who migrated to California from the Deep South to take these wartime jobs. It is important to note, however, one particular instance which disproportionately killed a high number of African Americans in the Navy at Port Chicago, which is kind of in between the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta and Suisun Bay. On Monday, July 17, 1944, two ammunition ships and a train exploded in a terrible blast at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on the south shore of Suisun Bay in Contra Costa County. Two-thirds of the 320 men who were killed were African American. They were part of a segregated unit assigned to the unenviable task of loading ammunition onto ships. 50 survivors refused to return to duty. They were convicted of treason, but ultimately Harry Truman released them from prison in 1946, but they had to go from prison back into the U.S. Navy. Their convictions were never overturned. It's a sad, sad state of affairs in U.S. military history with respect to discrimination against minorities. In this case, African Americans. It was a thankless job. And, really nobody wanted to do it, but they made these black guys do it. And when this explosion occurred, they were disproportionately, many of them killed. Asian Americans served in racially segregated units. The Koreans were in something called the Tiger Brigade. The Filipinos were in two segregated regiments in the Pacific. California-born Japanese enlisted in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. This combat team in the U.S. Army took heavy losses in the Allied invasion of Italy in 1943 and is the most decorated regiment in the U.S. Army, by the way. Of course, there were a group of Native Americans who were in a secret regiment at Camp Pendleton, the Marine base in northern San Diego County. They were the code talkers. They were the ones that broke the code of the Japanese, and so on. Latinos accounted for 10% of LA's population during World War II, but they represented 20% of the wartime casualties from this part of California. So you can see that minorities were discriminated against in the military and then disproportionately killed in military service. The rise of the aircraft industry is quite important because as men were going to war, women were the ones that needed to work in the aircraft industry to replace the men who went off to fight. Before the 1930s, the American aircraft industry was really quite small, and it was actually remaining small in the 1930s. Very few companies survived without military contracts. The names of those companies included Martin, Lockheed, spelled Loughead, which is really kind of a Scottish or a Scotch-Irish name. Eventually, they changed the spelling to Lockheed so that there was no confusion in the pronunciation. Northrop and Douglas. These are all small operations in California in the 1930s. As late as 1939, the United States was alarmingly unprepared for war. A year later, by May 1940, President Roosevelt called for an output of 50,000 aircraft a year. This was more than doubled by 1944, so it was really quite astounding. When Americans put their mind to something and it's for a just cause, it's very clear that we can rally to the cause. Sometimes I think that maybe be lost in our society today. So as a result of this ramping up for war, the aircraft business then became an enduring part of California industry, as you very well know. The wartime expansion of the aircraft industry crammed 40 years of industrial progress into just 40 months. In 1933, airframe factories in California employed only 1,000 people. A decade later, they employed more than 280,000 people. And as in shipbuilding, women were actively recruited to work in the aircraft industry. And of course, the thing that was the symbol was Rosie the Riveter. And this is a photograph from a documentary called The Life and Times of Rosie the Riveter, courtesy Clarity Productions documentary, clarityfilms.org. You can look that up. So Douglas and Lockheed and North American and Northrop were all in the LA area, and Convair and Ryan were in the San Diego area as far as aircraft manufacturing was concerned. In part 27B, we will discuss the internment of the Japanese.